We have 3 reports this year, starting with the lead pastor's report. So if you can start my slides there, Riley. I presented this to you a couple weeks ago, but there's a couple things that I want to really highlight into this. And the first is that we were established in 1887. Now, if you look at our history, it says in the winter of 1887 to 1888, which is a little nebulous, but however you look at that, our start was right in that 1887 time frame. And in that time, as I've shared before, and I'll share very briefly this morning, we had a man by the name of James Pollock who had a heart for what Jesus was doing. He came across an issue of the Gospel Trumpet, which was our Church of God newsletter essentially at the time, our periodical that allowed us to share with the world. And he asked for some people who would come to Denver to preach the gospel. And in that first year, they had 6 weeks of meetings where D.S. Warner, the founder of our movement himself, came in and began preaching with a crew of evangelists with one heart and one goal: to reach our city for Jesus. As I've shared with you before, we're in a new season. Some of you feel that more now this year than at our last annual meeting. But as I've kind of watched what's happening in our world, we are by far not the only ones. In fact, as I was talking to another longtime Church of God member this past week, our Church of God movement itself is in that renovation season. It's in that renewal season. And even if you look online or watch the commercials, you see Wells Fargo, and this resonated with me very well. Established 1852, reestablished 2018. Wells Fargo has said that they are now in a season where they realize they needed to make a recommitment to their patrons, a recommitment to their shareholders, and a recommitment to what made them who they were in the first place. And I feel like that is very apropos to where we are as a church. In this year, we are reestablishing. We are at year 131. But if you notice, we're also sort of entering into a new phase in year 1, where we recommit to our city. Go ahead and go on to the next slide, Riley. Where we recommit to our city in the midst of challenging times. If you look at this graphic, it says that only 6% of churches surveyed are growing. The reality is that in our nation right now, 65% of churches are in decline. Their attendance year over year has gone down. And up to 90% of all churches are not growing compared to the pace of the city that is around them. We are in one of the fastest growing parts of our city. It's growing at about 7% more than the rest of the rate of Denver. If you look at this block just right here, I've watched that over the last year, with the exception of about 2, maybe 3 houses now, that entire block is under new ownership. You'll notice one house says sold and one on the corner is selling as we speak. What's happening is that established churches between 40 and 90 years old are in decline more than others. You'll see churches like Red Rocks. You'll see churches like Flatirons, ones that have started out. Some of our friends at Lighthouse who have started out with a new vision and they've started to grow. But churches on the whole that are in our ballpark are declining and at a rapid rate. Churches that are in irreversible decline, as they say, are often now giving themselves over to congregations. In fact, just about a week ago, I was at the Severe Weather Shelter benefit, and one of our local leaders in Lakewood talked about how he said, you guys are going to make it, which I was like, good, thank you for saying that. We're going to make it. But he said, I know of several churches in our network that are not. And we need to start having conversations with them about how they transition well, how they can give their resources to other churches, how they can have those conversations. In fact, our friends at Lighthouse just had that same thing happen where a church in its older years, in decline, turned themselves over so that they could see a new day. However, what I want to point out from this is that in order to reverse the decline that we see around us, it's going to take both new churches and existing churches that revitalize and enter into a new season and enter into a new day. Go to my next slide, please. So here's the old truth. The thing I want each of us to understand is that the local church, not a building, but a people that gather together, is God's plan A for the world. Jesus is the salvation. He's the only source of salvation, but the local church is God's plan A to bring that hope into the world. And as I've heard said before, and I believe it, there is no plan B. And in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus says, I will build my church. We always have to remember that. Each church that we come across, while it is our church in that we are a part of it, it is Jesus' church and that we are a part of him. And he says, the gates of hell will not prevail. And so because of this promise, I am not scared for the future of the church. In fact, I believe that God is going to do something powerful, not just in our church, but in churches across our nation. We're just simply in a new day and a new era. Go to my next slide, please. So in your booklet, you'll see some numbers that I want to share with you that are our numbers through our 130th anniversary. But I want to point out something that I put on there very intentionally, because I have personally wrestled with this idea of, do we count people? Do we see how many people are in attendance? How do we count who's in? And there's this side of me that's like, oh, I don't want those numbers. But at the same time, for this sake, I do, because every number has a name. Every name has a story, and every story matters to God. And so I want to tell some of the story of this last year for us. We had 3 child dedications this past year. That is up from 0 the year before. So that's a good improvement right there. We had 7 baptisms in this last year, up from 1 in the previous year. We had 230 people in attendance on Easter Sunday of this last year. As some said, man, I haven't seen that many people in this building in a long time. And I'm going to talk about some things just briefly in a moment about how that worked well. We saw an average weekly attendance of 97. This is in the same year and a half, where I've personally been a part of or performed right around 12 funerals at this point. We've seen some move away. The Paraconis now live down in South Colorado. The Webbs moving to Florida. And we've still actually had our numbers maintained to grow in that. So that's a wonderful thing. Christmas of last year, we gave away $1,789 worth of gifts to 19 families who were not otherwise going to receive the gift of Christmas. And I've had some people say, could you clarify, what does that mean, the gift of Christmas? These are kids who are in families who would not be able to afford gifts. They would not be able to afford Christmas dinner. And as some of them indicated on their sheets last year, maybe one of you got, they don't have heat in their homes. And so we helped 19 families last Christmas. We now have 12 groups, up from 9 the prior year. We've started some new groups in this last season, and we are continuing to look for new groups and new group leaders. We've gone through 4 semesters with devotional material, and aside from the one that you have right now, the journal, those are all created by our staff. We work through those together, and that takes some doing. That takes some effort, but it's because we believe that God wants to transform your life. And even in the journal we have right now, we have our touches in that. We've also had some great words of congratulations and kudos. You'll see a few more of them in there in the stories section. But just a couple months ago, several weeks ago, I sat at lunch with Pastor Gordon Garrett, who's continued to share how excited he is for the day that we have coming and the moving forward. And my favorite line right here, he says, we continue to pray for you, and we also want to financially contribute to your support. I said, Gordon, thank you for that. They don't live here anymore. They've got their own thing going. We also had Pastor Allen share in this his own word of congratulations for what's been happening, and also just an update of what's happening there in Darlington, South Carolina. Allen and I have conversations somewhat frequently, not as often as I'd like, but he also is in a revitalization situation, a church that's 100 years old, that's asking these same questions that we're going to start asking even more powerfully. Going to my next slide here. And then Dr. Steve Rennick, our outside elder, shares with us how important it is for this congregation to see a new day, because literally the other Church of God churches in our city are looking to us and across the state to be that beacon of change and to pave that way forward, just as we are the first of our congregations. Next slide. You'll see a few other things that have happened throughout the year in this kind of checkerboard. Through the Emerge grant, we were able to do some of the things that we've been wanting to do around here. You'll see signage that's now throughout the hallways, our flags, our banners that are outside. And part of why we were able to see such a good success on Easter is through that Emerge grant, we were able to do some new online advertising through Facebook. And you may think, oh, what is that all about? But that's okay, because through the Facebook advertising nope, you were right, go back on the next slide. At Trunk or Treat, we saw 700 kids again this year. That doesn't count adults. Last year I was trying to count everybody. This year we did it by a very, very scientific system. We gave Heather a bag of 800 pieces of candy and said only give one per kid. And then at the end we counted how much she had left. And so last year we were seeing about 700 people. Every head counts. This year we saw about 700 kids. We've updated signage. We had about 9 people go through and do the Walk for Freedom. We had a back-to-school block party. We've seen a new website, a new presence. Go on to the next slide. And so we have this new day ahead of us, year 1. So what do I mean by that? Well, I was told by our search team before I got here, this church was within about 2 to 3 years away from closing its doors. From becoming one of the churches who had to decide what we were going to do with that next phase where we didn't exist anymore. But that's not our story anymore. We have turned the corner in some ways, but we've also seen that hard turn, that hard churn that happens. And so we are reestablishing in some ways to year 1. Not year 1 as in it's our first year all over again and we're getting rid of our history, but quite the opposite. We are on the road to our 150th anniversary, and this is the first year of that journey. Year 1 leading to 150. But the hard truth is that we've made some big changes. However, we've also, I personally, I should say, have also had some meetings with some of our young family members who have come into this city, who have come into this neighborhood and have come and visited our church. And while we have had some changes that for some, it feels like, oh my gosh, we have changed way too much in this season. A lot of them have come in, and as I've asked them, hey, how come you didn't stick around? They said 2 things. 1, I don't see enough young people around here. And 2, you are a very old church. And I'm like, wait a second, we've made so many changes, but they're not seeing those changes because they're just coming in now. They weren't here a year ago. But on the flip side, change realization is sitting in for some. We're in what I call that messy middle, where for many of you in this room, we're not what we used to be. It feels very different. And so I get to navigate, and our elders get to navigate this strange season where we're no longer what we were, but we're also not yet where we're reaching some of the others. And that messy middle is a difficult place to be. Because we all have to commit in a season where things don't quite yet make sense. We have to recommit to a church that is not what it was, but it is holding on to everything that made us who we are. You'll notice the reason I put Ed and Alan and Gordon on the screen is because I maintain relationships with them and they maintain relationships with us. We are holding on to that history. But at the same time, the need for change continues. Going to my next slide here. And so I want to point out a couple of things, but this is the main thing. On our road to year 150, as we enter year 1 again, we have to start asking some of the same questions that our forefathers, those pioneers who planted this church in 1887, who had that first set of meetings on a little brethren church, a little United Brethren church, and from there spawned what has now helped start the severe weather shelter, helped start Heart to Honduras, helped have an impact and a beginning for the shelter in Cuttack, India. We have to begin asking that question again. What does it take to reach our city? And what will it take to reach the next generation? Those are the questions our forefathers asked as they were building the church, and they're the questions we have to ask ourselves. But I want to point out, these are hard questions. Because the question, what will it take to reach the next generation, is one that, as I look at my son who does already these things with technology, I'm like, I don't understand that and I don't like it, Logan. And then I go, oh yeah, And I'm bringing technology in and people are going, I don't understand it, I don't like it, but we all have to have that moment of realization to say, is that where our city is going? Is that where the next generation is going? Because if we want to have a vibrant community, a vibrant life, not that excludes anyone, but where those of us who are more seasoned in our faith make sacrifices and intentionally ask the questions so that we can reach our city, it brings about a new paradigm. Go on to my next slide here real quick. And so, in this next season, we have to have a laser focus on our vision. This past year, our elders got together and set a God-sized vision to have a transformational impact on 1% of our community, one person at a time. And as we move into this year one concept, we're going to start to have a even greater focus on what that looks like. Some of the ways we're going to do that, go on the next slide for me real quick, are through a renewed commitment to this church and to our city. I mentioned it last week. Something I've started to wrestle with in my own spirit is, hey, if there's sports, if there's games, if there's kids' activities, if there's something coming up, I get a pass because I kind of have to be here, right? But what about Renee and Logan? And we had that conversation that no, if there's something going on, unless Logan's just going to get absolutely booted out for it, we're going to be here because church is our primary commitment. Not because church is more important than what his games are going to be, but because at those games, he's not going to learn who Jesus is. He's not going to interact with God's people in the way that he does here. And so over this next few months, we're going to start into a new process, and we'll see it here in a moment. This multi-year campaign. And part of that is going to be an asking of a recommitment to the church. A recommitment to be here on Sundays. A recommitment to be present, to reach out to someone else. And as a part of that commitment, we are going to ask you, not right now, it's going to come up, I'm giving you a heads up as we get into Easter, to write down the name of someone that you feel like Jesus is laying on your heart. And I'm going to ask you to have an impact on that one person. We are also starting a process that the elders have begun just this past Thursday night with a company called Generis. You'll see it on the opposite page of the proposed budget summary. Generis is one of the leading companies in church health and development. So what that means is they help us to reestablish a vision, and then they also help us to see funding arrive for that vision. I've had a few people who have known what we've done ask, why would we pay to have someone come in and help us raise money? Well, Willow Creek Church, which we try not to talk about a lot right now because they have their own struggle going on, but when they were ready to raise $100 million, they called the same company we're calling. In fact, the guy that we had come in and speak to us on Thursday night, our elders met for 3 hours, both elders current and those who are proposed on the ballot. That man actually had a commitment to himself that he would not work with churches under 2,000 people in attendance. And God challenged him on this, and he said, okay, if you send something my way, I'll respond to it. And guess who came knocking? That was us. And so yes, we are paying a consultant to come in and help us to have a campaign. But here's the thing I want you to understand as we get into the budget and where things are. Someone already paid for that for us. You need to understand that. Yes, it cost us money. And somebody said, actually 2 families said, I believe in this so much, I'm covering the cost of this. And so we're going to enter into a multi-year one fund campaign. We'll be explaining it a little bit more, but the concept is pretty simple. Instead of chasing after a capital campaign where, hey, we're going to build a new building or etc., and then when the building is done, we're like, cool, that's over. We're entering into a discipleship and stewardship process where as the campaign goes, the one fund is our ministry fund. And we'll begin looking and talking about what that looks like going on, where we no longer support things out just completely separate from, but all the ministry that we do is in that one fund. So when you give to the budget, you're giving to our missions partners. When you give to the budget, you're giving to keep the lights on, as Kelly said. You're giving to transformation of the building. You're giving to the kids ministry and the youth ministry and the life groups ministry that happens every single week. And so essentially, what we're going to look at is in this year one campaign, we're going to ask every one person to make a commitment to the church, and to invest in one other person every year. We're going to ask for a financial commitment. We're going to ask for a commitment of your presence. And we're going to ask for a renewal of commitment and excitement to what God is going to do in this church. But I want you to understand and know why I'm saying every one person, because as I got here, the first message I shared with you out of Ephesians is that my role as pastor is not to be the person who does every single thing in the building. Although that happens sometimes, and I know what I signed on for. My role as pastor is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And so each one of us reinvesting in that ministry, not so that it's just nebulously the church, but we are the church. Do I have a last slide here? What's my next one, Riley? Thank you. So I want to just end my report by saying, welcome to year one. We're in a new day. The church as a whole is in a new day. Our church, the churches around our city, the conversations that Cloverdale is having, that Arvada is having, that East Denver is having, they are looking to us to start leading that way and paving a new path as we reestablish that connection that first pioneering set of individuals said, what will it take to reach this city? I believe that year 150 is going to be a hallmark year. I hope I'm here for it. I hope I'm your pastor still at that time. You know, maybe you boot me out by then, I don't know, but I would love to be here for it. But whoever's here, I believe that this church and this legacy, these 130 moving into 150 years that we've had, will be a tale that our children and grandchildren will continue to tell about a church, a body of people who were bold enough to meet the times that they found themselves in and reverse decline, reverse aging, and to meet a new day. So I hope you'll join me on that journey, because these next 20 years are going to be a lot of fun. Just remember, right now we're in that messy middle, the hard part that you start with. But God is bringing some amazing things to us over this next year, and we will see some fantastic things begin to happen.